Claire, we're not running a museum for American payroll anymore, Julian Mercer said, standing at the head of the glass conference table in his white sneakers and pale blue shirt, smiling like he had just solved weather. Document the domestic controls, hand them to Owen, and we'll let the transition team clean this up over the weekend. The room smelled like lemon polish and burnt espresso. My printed access maps were still warm from the copier. His brother-in-law was already writing over my staffing grid with a red marker. I capped my pen, looked at Julian, and nodded once. Of course, I said. I'll update the attestation record tonight. If you enjoy stories where executive confidence collides with the exact wording of its own contracts, like and subscribe. This one aged beautifully by Tuesday. My name was Claire Donnelly. I was 48 years old, and for 12 years I was the invisible foundation under Meridian Atlas, whether the board knew it or not. Meridian Atlas was a mid-market enterprise software company based in Cincinnati, Ohio. We built claims workflow, document processing, fraud review, and case management systems for regional banks, insurers, hospital networks, and 2 federal subcontractors who preferred quiet vendors with boring websites and extremely reliable controls. Publicly, Meridian liked to call itself a digital transformation partner. Internally, it was a controlled delivery business wearing a software company's blazer. That distinction mattered. Software companies can afford vanity. Controlled delivery businesses cannot. Not if clients are handing you customer records, claims images, payment disputes, internal audit work papers, or any data that becomes expensive the moment the wrong person opens it from the wrong country. My title was Senior Director of Sovereign Delivery Assurance. It sounded abstract enough to be ignored at holiday parties and important enough to be copied on every angry client escalation. That was about right. I was not the face of the company. I was the reason the face could keep making promises. I had joined Meridian when we were still operating out of 2 floors above a furniture wholesaler. The server room was loud, the coffee was terrible, and every executive believed operational risk could be solved by being careful. I came in from a larger financial services processor, where I had spent 9 years learning that companies do not really understand compliance until it gets attached to revenue. At Meridian, I built the thing nobody else would have built because it looked too technical to sell and too expensive to brag about. It was called Anchor. Officially, the system was the Anchor Delivery Residency and Control Matrix, though almost everyone just called it Anchor because even busy adults have limits. Anchor was not one platform. It was a control architecture. Role maps, identity layers, queue restrictions, geofencing rules, audit evidence chains, privileged access boundaries, exception workflows, client-specific handling covenants, encryption path enforcement, change control records, and attestation libraries tied to each major account. It decided who could touch what, from where, under which contract, with what evidence, and under whose sign-off. If a bank client required all dispute image review to remain in the continental United States, Anchor enforced that at the queue level. If a hospital network required only screened domestic analysts to handle claim correspondence containing PHI, Anchor enforced that at the user group and document class level. If a federal subcontract required that no production support session involving regulated case files could be initiated by non-US-based personnel, Anchor blocked it before the request finished pretending to be efficient. Most executives heard that and thought permissions. That was adorable. Anchor was not permissions. It was contract law translated into operational reality. I built it because Meridian kept signing larger clients faster than the company could mature. Sales loved the growth. Operations loved the volume. Legal loved pretending everything was manageable as long as the exhibits were signed. Then 3 things happened inside 1 calendar year. A regional bank asked us to prove that its fraud review queues had never been touched offshore. A hospital system demanded user-level evidence showing that PHI-bearing correspondence had only been accessed by approved domestic teams. And a federal subcontractor required a named control officer to attest, in writing, that Meridian's live delivery model matched the domestic handling restrictions in the master service schedule. At that point, everyone finally turned and looked at the boring woman with the binders. That was me. I built the first version of Anchor in 11 months, with 1 security analyst, one database engineer, and enough coffee to dissolve a lesser person. We mapped every client environment, every support queue, every privileged role, every admin pathway, every exception lane. We tied contractual handling requirements to identity groups and routing rules. We created domestic-only queue classes, U.S. person verification tags, restricted document families, and segmented admin tiers. Then I added the part executives never think about until it hurts. Evidence. If you cannot prove a control existed, the control becomes a motivational poster. Anchor-generated evidence packages. Login location proofs. Role assignment histories. Queue access records. Escalation approvals. Change control timestamps. Exception approvals with attached business reasons. It all flowed into a controlled archive that clients, auditors, and internal counsel could inspect when they needed to know whether Meridian's promises were real. Over the next 8 years, Anchor became the load-bearing wall inside the company. It supported 61 enterprise client environments. It governed 4,300 user role mappings. It enforced 217 client-specific delivery restrictions. It handled 39 exception classes and 12 critical escalation pathways. When a sales executive promised a large insurer that all first-touch claims indexing would remain onshore, it was Anchor making that sentence legal. When a federal subcontractor renewed our statement of work because we could prove domestic handling continuity over a full year, it was Anchor making that possible. When our outside auditor wrote that Meridian's control environment was mature for its size, I printed the line and put it in a drawer because sometimes private satisfaction is enough. I was also the named Sovereign Delivery Attestation Officer for the company. That was my weapon. Not in a dramatic sense. Not at first. More like the kind of weapon grown adults build by being the only one in the room who reads the fourth attachment. Because Meridian's biggest clients did not merely want a system. They wanted a person. A named officer who was responsible for attesting that Meridian's actual operating model matched the domestic delivery restrictions and restricted access commitments in their contracts. They wanted that person to review material service model changes, certify exception controls, and file client-facing notices if domestic handling conditions changed. That person was me in 23 separate master service exhibits. Not my department. Not a roll box. Me, Claire Donnelly. It happened incrementally. One bank wanted the named officer on the schedule. Then a healthcare client copied the language. Then legal standardized it because standardization is the corporate version of admitting a woman was right 18 months late. By year 9, the language existed in almost every meaningful contract we had. If Meridian made a material change to domestic staffing, delivery routing, privileged support geography, or restricted queue access, the attestation officer had to file a change review, confirm control equivalence, and notify affected clients where required. If there was no qualified attestation officer in place, then Anchor's restricted residency mode took effect automatically for affected environments. That mode did not shut the company down. That would have been melodramatic, and I do not respect melodrama in enterprise settings. Restricted residency mode did something cleaner. It froze new provisioning into any queue or role tied to domestic-only or U.S. person handling restrictions. It blocked offshore access to restricted environments. It suspended client exception approvals. It denied routing changes that expanded work from domestic teams to unvalidated teams. It tagged active service model changes as pending attestation. It generated control gap notices for clients whose contracts required material change disclosure. In other words, the lights stayed on. The dashboard stayed green enough for panicked executives to lie to themselves. People still logged in. Tickets still moved. Calls still got answered. But all the shortcuts Julian wanted were dead on arrival. Before Julian Mercer showed up, Meridian was not perfect. No company that made money at scale ever is. But it was run by people who at least knew the difference between speed and sloppiness. Our CEO then, Teresa Lyle, had risen through operations. She understood margins, but she also understood rework, client distrust, audit fatigue, and the reality that you cannot offshore a promise after it has already been sold as domestic. She did not particularly enjoy my decks, but she listened to them, which is the corporate equivalent of affection. Legal was led by Priya Shah, who was concise in the way knives are concise. Priya and I worked together so often that we had developed a silent vocabulary across conference tables. One raised eyebrow from her meant the client was about to ask a dangerous question. One tap of my pen meant the sales team had already answered it incorrectly. Our infrastructure lead, Ben Su, understood systems the way mechanics understand weather. He could look at a proposed shortcut and tell you whether it was annoying, expensive, or fatal. Usually fatal. We had 3 onshore delivery pods in Ohio, Indiana, and Western Pennsylvania. Quiet teams. Good people. Claims review specialists, queue managers, escalation analysts, support engineers, exception coordinators. Adults with mortgages and practical shoes doing work that nobody in leadership meetings ever described correctly. I carried the company invisibly because invisible work is often the real work. I saved a $14.6 million banking renewal by proving 18 months of compliant domestic queue handling after a competitor had a data routing incident. I rebuilt our hospital network segmentation model after a failed vendor patch nearly merged restricted document classes into a general review lane. That prevented an exposure event nobody ever mentioned again, because the best crises are the ones the board never learns how close they came. I wrote the restricted residency policy that let us onboard a federal subcontract worth $9.8 million over 3 years. I cut exception approval time from 3 business days to 11 hours without widening risk, which made sales think I had become fun. I was not fun. I was useful. Then Teresa retired. The board decided the company needed fresh strategic ambition, and they hired Julian Mercer. Julian was 39, though he carried himself like a man who had been pre-approved by life much earlier. Tall, narrow, very clean teeth, expensive watches chosen to appear casual, and the kind of white sneakers men wear when they need to signal vision rather than traction. He had come from a software roll-up in Chicago where, according to the press release, he had led global delivery optimization and margin transformation. That last phrase should have come with a fire alarm. He spoke in investor-ready fragments. Leaner model. Scalable labor strategy. Distributed excellence. Borderless talent. He never said outsourcing at first. Men like Julian prefer to perfume the body before they drag it through the lobby. He also arrived with people. Owen Mercer, his brother-in-law, came in as Executive Vice President of Delivery Transformation despite a background that was mostly staffing procurement and one brief, suspiciously vague stint in a fintech operations role. Owen wore quarter zips that cost too much and had the posture of a man who thought moving quickly was the same as understanding. He tapped conference tables with 2 knuckles when he got excited, which was often and usually for bad reasons. Then came Lila Voss, one of Julian's former coworkers, now installed as Chief Workforce Strategy Officer. Lila was polished, very articulate, and deeply committed to the idea that any problem can be solved if you call it a talent marketplace. She had never run a restricted queue in her life. She spoke about domestic teams the way consultants speak about parking lots. Within 3 weeks, Julian had also brought in 2 directors from his previous company, one vendor selection lead who somehow already knew Owen, and a chief of staff whose main function seemed to be nodding half a second before Julian finished talking. The temperature changed immediately. Meetings got glossier and thinner. Words got safer. Useful objections started arriving by text after meetings instead of inside them. People who had once challenged numbers in the room began waiting until the hallway, because the room now belonged to Julian's network, and everyone knew it. His first executive review with me told me everything I needed to know. I walked him through Anchor. Not the full anatomy. The adult summary. Client-restricted environments, domestic handling commitments, attestation triggers, and the control implications of any move toward offshore support. He listened for about 7 minutes, leaned back in his chair, and said, "I think we may be over-romanticizing geography." I remember the smell of cold coffee in that room. I remember the soft hum of the recessed lights. I remember Ben staring at his laptop because he knew I was deciding which version of myself to use. So I gave Julian the mild version. "It isn't romance," I said. "It's contractual delivery architecture." He smiled. Not because he understood. Because he thought my precision was decorative. "Right," he said. But if a skilled analyst in Manila can process a claim image just as well as a skilled analyst in Cincinnati, then this sounds like a management story, not a legal one. Priya, who was on the call, said, "It is a legal one." Julian nodded at her the way people nod at turbulence. Annoyed, but still committed to arrival. The next month, he started reviewing labor concentration. That was the phrase he used. Review. Concentration. As though American teams were a technical irregularity rather than the operating model our contracts described in painful detail. Owen was put in charge of a 60-day delivery modernization plan. Lila began running workforce analytics showing cost per task variance by geography, which is a charming way to reduce real people to a slide deck. Suddenly our Ohio and Indiana teams were red bars. Offshore scenarios were green bars. Every slide looked smarter than it was. I watched it happen the way you watch someone open a locked door with confidence and the wrong key. Julian's first truly revealing line came in a steering committee meeting with finance, legal, delivery, and client operations. He pointed at an onshore staffing slide and said, "We're paying Midwest rates for work that should be location agnostic by now." Midwest rates. He meant American salaries. He meant adults who had spent years keeping our promises intact. He meant the people who had worked through holiday surges, hurricane reroutes, audit weeks, and quarter-end staffing gaps because Meridian kept telling clients that the domestic delivery model was a feature rather than a cost problem. Nobody said anything for about 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds told me everybody in the room knew exactly what he meant and exactly what kind of man he was. He had the kind of confidence you develop when no one has ever forced you to clean up your own simplifications. Then the ignorance got specific. Owen asked for admin-level exports of Anchor's residency matrices so his transformation team could translate them into more dynamic talent routing. That sentence was a crime scene in 9 words. I told him the matrices were not staffing preferences. They were contract-bound control maps. He said, "Everything is a process if you zoom out." That is the sort of thing a man says when all the real consequences happen below his altitude. Lila wanted to pilot follow-the-sun queue balancing for overnight claims documentation. That would have routed domestic-only work classes into foreign support windows unless the restrictions were preserved. I stopped the pilot in review. Julian was irritated. "We cannot let a homegrown control library become a veto over strategy," he said. Homegrown control library. That was how he described the thing underpinning $127 million in contracted revenue. I kept my face neutral. They thought Anchor was software with opinions. What they didn't know was it was software with clients attached. The public disrespect came 5 weeks later in the Monday operating review. 42 people on the call. Some in the room. Most on video. Finance. Delivery. Client success. Legal. HR. Operations. My domestic pod leads. Ben. Priya. And Julian at the front, sleeves rolled once, standing too close to the display like proximity could replace command. Owen had already circulated the new model that morning. 3 domestic teams consolidated. 2 Ohio Q groups eliminated. Overnight restricted review support shifted into an offshore center of excellence in Cebu. Tier 2 admin escalations rerouted to Krakow. Domestic exception approvals centralized under Owen's transformation office, which was one of the dumber things I had ever seen committed to a PDF. I spoke when the floor opened for objections. "This cannot go live," I said. "Not without client review, attestation updates, and contract-by-contract impact analysis. 23 accounts have named domestic handling commitments. 9 require material change notification. 4 prohibit this outright." Julian looked at me, then at the room, then back at me. "This," he said, tapping the slide with one finger, "is exactly why we're simplifying." A few people shifted in their seats. He continued. "Claire has been invaluable. But we cannot keep wrapping a labor model in compliance language every time the company wants to grow up. Not cruel. Worse. Casual." Then he delivered the line from the opening. "We're not running a museum for American payroll anymore. Document the domestic controls, hand them to Owen, and we'll let the transition team clean this up over the weekend." Everybody heard it. My pod leads heard it. Priya heard it. Ben heard it. HR heard it and suddenly became fascinated by notepad margins. Julian believed he had just won because he thought the argument was about sentiment. He thought I was defending people. I was. But not only people. I was defending the legal structure inside which those people were permitted to touch client work at all. I kept my pen. Of course, I said. I'll update the attestation record tonight. Then I closed my folder, stood up, and walked out. No speech. No trembling. No warning. Just one sentence, quiet enough that the smart people in the room heard the weight and the dumb people heard agreement. In the hallway outside the conference room, Priya caught up with me near the windows overlooking the river. She held a legal pad against her chest and said, "How bad is he about to make this?" I said, "Faster than he thinks." She nodded once. "Do you need anything from me?" "Only if they try to call it paperwork." That got the smallest possible smile. "They will." "I know." I went back to my office, shut the door, and sat still for half a minute. Not to calm down. I already was calm. I just wanted to make sure I was moving from structure, not insult. Then I opened Anchor's governance console. The first step was internal. At 6:08 p.m., I completed Form SDR-4, Material Service Model Change Pending Attestation. I had drafted the template 4 years earlier with Priya and one external auditor who had the haunted expression of a man who had seen too many client notices written by marketing departments. I entered the trigger conditions precisely. Proposed expansion of restricted work classes to non-domestic delivery personnel. Proposed reassignment of privileged escalation lanes to unvalidated foreign support groups. Named attestation officer stripped of independent review authority. No qualified successor designated. That mattered. More than Julian understood. Because the attestation officer language in our contracts did not merely say a review should occur. It said a material service model change affecting domestic handling restrictions had to be reviewed and certified by the designated officer or qualified successor before implementation. No officer. No certification. No certification. Restricted residency mode. At 6:14 p.m., I marked 23 affected client environments as pending attestation failure risk. At 6:19 p.m., I initiated restricted residency mode for all environments with named domestic handling covenants or U.S. person access requirements. That one action cascaded through 5 control layers. It froze creation of any new foreign user groups against restricted queues. It blocked role expansion requests tied to Cebu and Krakow delivery profiles. It suspended exception approvals for routing domestic-only workloads offshore. It tagged pending workforce remaps as control invalid. And it prepared automatic client change notices for any account requiring disclosure of material model changes or attestation lapses. Then I completed the part executives always forget exists. I filed the notices. Not broad panic notices. Not drama. The boring, lawful kind. At 6:32 p.m., 9 clients received formal service model change review notices through their risk portals. At 6:41 p.m., our outside SOC control liaison received an attestation gap advisory. At 6:47 p.m., the federal subcontract compliance contact received a control preservation update stating that no non-domestic access expansion could occur until successor attestation review was complete. At 6:53 p.m., I sent an internal governance notice to Julian, Owen, Lila, Priya, Ben, HR, and the board risk liaison explaining that restricted residency mode had been activated pursuant to contractual and attestation obligations. I use the phrase pursuant to because it has the right texture when someone has just mistaken authority for volume. Then I did one more thing. I filed my resignation effective immediately upon removal of independent attestation authority. That was required under the client schedules. If the named attestation officer no longer held independent review control, the officer had to notify Meridian and cease attesting. I was very fond of contracts that made adults tell the truth about themselves. At 7:12 p.m., Ben called. I answered because Ben understood systems and never wasted words. "You actually did it," he said. "Yes." He exhaled softly. Owen's team already submitted 64 provisioning requests for Cebu. I assumed they would. "They're all dead." "Yes." A pause. Then he said, "They still don't know why." "They will." Do you want my advice? Always. Turn your phone on silent and make salmon or pasta or whatever competent women in these stories eat when the board deserves consequences. I was thinking roast chicken. That feels appropriately domestic. I liked Ben. At 7:45 p.m., I drove home. I stopped for groceries. Lemon, rosemary, potatoes, green beans, a bottle of white wine cheap enough to be honest. My dog, Maple, met me at the door carrying one sock she had stolen from the laundry room with the serene confidence of someone not burdened by shareholders. I cooked. The chicken skin crisped. The kitchen smelled like garlic and butter. I ate at the counter while rain tapped softly against the windows. At 9:18 p.m., Julian called the first time. At 9:26 p.m., Owen. At 9:31 p.m., Lila. At 9:44 p.m., Julian again. By 11 p.m., I had 7 missed calls and 4 texts. Julian, need clarification on the restriction alert. Owen, your control system blocked the workforce cutover. Lila, there are error messages all over the queue provisioning panel. Julian again, call me tonight please. This is time sensitive. I washed my plate, watched half an old detective movie, took Maple outside, and slept all night without interruption. They thought I had made a protest. What they didn't know was I had simply let the contracts become visible. The first stage of panic arrived Tuesday at 6:12 a.m. That was when Owen's transformation team attempted the Cebu cutover. They had planned a staggered provisioning window starting at 6 o'clock. 64 new foreign analyst accounts. 12 supervisor overlays. 4 admin support permissions. 3 restricted queue mappings. They had spreadsheets ready, vendor staffing committed, and one of those absurd project plans that uses a lot of cheerful colors to describe risk. Anchor denied 61 of the 64 provisioning requests immediately. The error language was plain. Restricted residency mode active. Domestic handling covenant enforced. Foreign group provisioning blocked pending attestation. The remaining 3 requests processed only because they were tied to unrestricted training sandboxes with no client data, which meant Owen's great transition opened exactly nowhere useful. He assumed, naturally, that IT had misconfigured the rollout. So he called Ben. Ben reviewed the logs, saw the control flags, and told him the system was operating correctly. Owen then called the vendor staffing lead and said, according to Ben later, can't you just mirror the domestic role IDs and force the mapping? Vendors love that question because it tells them who not to trust. The staffing lead refused. No authorized client environment mapping. No attested control equivalence. No contractual cover. By 7:03 a.m., the overnight queue balancing model Julian had promised finance was dead. No Cebu support. No Krakow escalations. No domestic team retained at the previous level because they had already been told they were being cut. No adult left in the room except the people Julian had just tried to replace. At 7:19 a.m., my phone lit up again. Julian, this is not acceptable. Call me now. Owen, we need the override path. Lila, Claire, I think the system has trapped itself. That last one was my favorite. Trapped itself. Like a parachute deploying was a form of self-harm. Stage 2 began at 9:40 a.m. when the first restricted queue backed up. Meridian processed first touch dispute images for 3 regional banks. Those queues were time-sensitive. Not same-hour urgent, but close enough that backlog becomes visible quickly. One of the Ohio pods had been told to stand down for transition planning under Owen's model. The Cebu team could not enter the queue. By mid-morning, the image backlog had climbed past the normal threshold. Then the service level clock started to blink. At 10:11 a.m., client operations opened 2 internal priority tickets. At 10:26 a.m., one bank account manager asked why dispute indexing volume had fallen 38% against forecast. At 10:34 a.m., a second bank asked why their overnight handoff report was missing. That report came from a queue now stranded between a domestic team Julian had insulted and a foreign team Anchor would not permit. Owen tried to get around it by instructing one Cincinnati supervisor to bulk release the queue for temporary support access. The supervisor, a woman named Denise Walcott who had been with Meridian for 10 years, replied in writing that the queue was domestic restricted under client exhibit and she would not violate the map. I respected Denise more after that. Julian then got on a call with client operations and tried to frame the slowdown as a scheduled service model migration. That phrase made it into a client notes field, which later became one of those delightful facts lawyers keep forever. At 11:02 a.m., I got my first voicemail from Julian. "Claire, this is Julian. I need you to stop being procedural and just explain where the release is. We're having a transition issue, and there is no reason a controls library should be able to block core staffing decisions." He said controls library again. It was impressive, really. The discipline of being wrong in the exact same way under pressure. I deleted the voicemail and took Maple for a walk. The air smelled like wet pavement and cut grass. The sky had that flat gray Midwest look that makes offices feel even more fluorescent than they are. Across town, I imagined Owen staring at red queue numbers and learning what a contract can do to optimism. Stage 3 arrived by Tuesday afternoon when the clients started reading their portals. The first formal response came from Ashbridge Regional Bank. Dry tone. One paragraph. Beautifully menacing. "Please clarify whether Meridian Atlas has initiated or intends to initiate any offshore staffing or non-domestic access expansion affecting dispute imaging, fraud review, case escalation, or production support under Schedule 7 domestic handling restrictions." That was the adult version of smelling smoke. Then River State Health sent a similar request asking whether any support model change could affect PHI-bearing correspondence or document indexing. And at 2:43 p.m., the federal subcontract compliance officer wrote the sentence that landed like a hammer. "Please identify the currently designated sovereign delivery attestation officer for Meridian Atlas." There wasn't one. Not anymore. No one could answer that honestly without admitting the company had severed the exact role tied to material change attestation while simultaneously attempting to expand offshore delivery. Priya understood immediately. Of course she did. She called me at 3:02 p.m. I answered. "The federal team is asking who signs now," she said. "No one." "I know." A pause. Then, "Julian is still trying to present this as internal process noise." That seems on brand. He also asked whether we could designate Owen temporarily. I laughed once. Quietly. Priya did not. I told him no. Good. Then she said the line that turned the whole week. "The auditors are in the lobby tomorrow." There it was. Not metaphorical auditors. Real ones. Our outside SOC control review firm had accelerated a site visit after my attestation gap advisory and the client notices. Nothing sharpens professional curiosity like a control officer resigning on the same day an offshore cutover stalls. I thanked Priya, ended the call, and made coffee. Stage 4 was Wednesday, and Wednesday was excellent. By 8:15 a.m., Meridian's main conference floor was full of purposeful shoes and tense smiles. 2 auditors. 1 client assurance representative from Ashbridge. Priya. Ben. Finance. Client operations. Julian in a charcoal suit this time, as though fabric could restore technical authority. The auditors asked for 4 things first. The current attestation officer designation. The material service model change review record. Evidence of control equivalence for any proposed non-domestic staffing expansion. And the client notification log. Meridian had exactly one of those 4 in usable condition. My notification log. The rest was either incomplete, invalid, or non-existent. Julian tried to explain that the company was in the middle of a strategic workforce redesign and that some governance artifacts had not caught up. That is the kind of sentence executives use when they want control evidence to behave like luggage. The lead auditor, a calm woman named Marin Chu with rimless glasses and no spare patience, asked him, did the proposed operating change occur before or after the designated attestation authority was removed? Julian started answering in circles. Priya answered instead. Before formal successor designation, she said. Marin wrote that down. Very neatly. Then Ashbridge's assurance representative asked, who approved the risk equivalency between the domestic queue and the proposed offshore queue? Nobody. Nobody had approved it because there was no equivalency review. Owen had a cost model, a ramp chart, and 3 calls with a vendor. that is not the same as contract-bound control equivalence, no matter how many tabs the spreadsheet has. By 10:40 a.m., the auditors had expanded the review. By 11:05 a.m., Ashbridge paused a pending 3-year renewal worth $27 million until Meridian could reestablish attestation control. By 11:18 a.m., River State suspended approval of a new document processing module expansion worth $4.2 million annually. At 11:33 a.m., Julian called me twice in 4 minutes. At 11:41 a.m., he left another voicemail. "Claire, this has gone far enough. We can discuss your concerns later. Right now I need you to tell Priya and the auditors that this is an administrative lag, not a control failure." Administrative lag. I replayed that one once because it deserved to be archived in memory. It wasn't an administrative lag. It was a man discovering that labor strategy becomes legal fact the moment you sign it into a client schedule. Stage 5 began Thursday morning with the queue collapse. Because while the auditors were admiring Julian's decision-making, the actual work was still arriving. Dispute images, claims packets, review letters, escalations, access requests, exception tickets. All the dull, relentless machinery of operating a delivery company in real life. The domestic pod leaders had not sabotaged anything. They kept working. That part mattered to me. But morale had cratered, staffing forecasts were broken, and no one trusted management enough to volunteer beyond policy. Why would they? One Ohio queue hit 19 hours behind. Another crossed the internal threshold that required client reporting. A healthcare correspondence class missed its turnaround commitment for the first time in 14 months. Then an escalation supervisor in Indiana submitted a written refusal to approve temporary queue dilation because the proposed change path lacked attestation and could expose domestic restricted document classes to unvalidated personnel. He was right. He was also now officially the kind of employee executives call not solution-oriented right before the company needs him to save it. At 1:09 p.m., finance circulated a revenue impact estimate. Immediate delayed or at-risk value across paused renewals, suspended expansions, service credits, and productivity loss, $18.7 million. That number got the board's attention. At 1:22 p.m., Julian's chief of staff texted me from an unknown number. "Claire, the board would appreciate a short call to resolve misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. That was a charming word for we set money on fire because the CEO wanted cheaper labor and shinier slides. I did not reply. At 2:47 p.m., Ben sent me a screenshot. Subject line, urgent board risk session. Body text, need immediate restoration options. Can anyone else sign the bridge letter? That was the gut punch. Can anyone else sign the bridge letter? No. Not because I was hoarding authority. Because the attestation schedules required a qualified, designated officer with documented review authority over the control library, client environments, and service model impact map. You do not replace that by asking whoever still has battery life in their phone. Stage 6 arrived late Thursday when the lenders noticed. Meridian was not public, but it had a revolving credit facility tied to revenue covenants and growth assumptions. The paused Ashbridge renewal and the River State suspension were enough to trigger questions. Once finance disclosed the operational review and pending client concern around delivery controls, the lending group requested an emergency update on material customer risk. By 5:35 p.m., the board had scheduled a Friday morning emergency session and instructed Priya to arrange my participation through counsel. That was how grown-up panic sounds. Not yelling. Calendars. I met with my attorney that evening. Her name was Rebecca Sloan, and she had the serene competence of a woman who never confused urgency with weakness. We sat in a conference room that smelled like paper, toner, and deliberate billing. Rebecca had already printed everything. My attestation schedules, the governance notices, Julian's written cutover plan, my resignation, the client portal notices, the audit request, the provisioning denials. The board risk email Ben had sent. "Do you want them repaired?" she asked, or instructed. "Both," I said. She nodded. "Good. Then we price clarity." Friday morning, I walked into Meridian's top-floor boardroom at 9 o'clock sharp. The room was all riverview and expensive wood, the sort of space companies use when they want fear to look premium. Around the table sat 4 board members: Finance, Priya, Ben, the lender's observer on video, Ashbridge's assurance lead, and Julian at the far end, trying very hard to look like a man still in charge of events. He did not. His tie was crooked by half an inch. His jaw was tight. He had the brittle stillness of someone holding together a story that no longer matched the evidence. Board Chair Malcolm Center opened the meeting. "Ms. Donnelly, thank you for attending." I nodded. Rebecca set her folders down and did not waste time pretending this was social. Malcolm continued. "We need to understand what, precisely, was lost." "Not access," I said. "Authority." That changed the room immediately. So I walked them through it. Slowly. Clearly. No flourishes. I explained Anchor's contract-bound control model, the role of the named attestation officer, the material change provisions, the restricted residency trigger conditions, the client schedules requiring domestic handling continuity, the effect of removing independent review authority, and why the offshore cutover died the moment Owen tried to provision it. Ben supported where needed. Priya confirmed the contract language. Ashbridge's assurance lead said very little, which is how you know the stakes are real. Then Malcolm turned to Julian. "Were you aware these planned workforce changes required attestation review before implementation?" Julian said, "I was aware Claire had concerns about pace." "That was not the question." Malcolm repeated it. This time Julian said, "I did not believe the issue rose to the level of a business constraint." There it was. The real sentence. He did not believe the issue rose to the level of reality. Rebecca slid across a printed email I had sent 6 weeks earlier. Subject: Offshore delivery expansion constraints under domestic handling schedules. Bullet 2. No expansion of restricted queue handling to non-domestic teams may occur without attestation review and, for specified clients, prior written notice. Bullet 3. Removal of current attestation officer without qualified successor will trigger restricted residency mode in affected environments. Julian glanced at the page, then away from it. Malcolm read both bullets in silence. The lender's observer asked, "Did management proceed anyway?" Priya said yes. Again, quiet. Not polite quiet. Boardroom quiet. The kind that has funding attached. Julian finally looked at me. "Claire," he said, "just tell them you can reverse the restriction and we'll sort the paperwork in parallel." There it was. Desperation dressed as practicality. I folded my hands on the table. "It isn't paperwork," I said. "It's permission." He stared at me. I continued. "You sold a domestic operating model, tried to replace it with a cheaper foreign one, removed the only officer authorized to review the change, and then acted surprised when the contracts noticed." No raised voice. I did not need one. Malcolm asked the only useful question left. "What does restoration require?" Rebecca looked at me. I looked back at her, then at the board. "I will not return under Julian Mercer, Owen Mercer, or any transformation office they control," I said. "If Meridian wants restoration, it happens on structural terms." I laid them out one by one. I would accept appointment as Chief Sovereign Delivery Officer, reporting directly to the Board Risk Committee and General Counsel for any material service model changes affecting restricted environments. Base compensation, $435,000. Annual target bonus, 40%. Signing bonus, $150,000. Equity grant, 0.8%. Full operational authority over Anchor, domestic handling controls, attestation schedules, client change reviews, and restricted workforce design. Reinstatement of all domestic pod leads affected by the proposed cutover, plus retention raises for the 3 highest-risk queue supervisors who had kept the company honest. Immediate removal of Owen Mercer and Lila Voss from any authority over restricted delivery design, queue routing, or staffing transitions tied to client control commitments. And one more condition. A formal board memorandum and client-facing remediation report documenting that the incident resulted from unauthorized executive attempts to alter the domestic delivery model without attestation review. Julian reacted to that last one exactly as I expected. "Absolutely not," he said. You do not get to write a confession for this company. Rebecca looked at him as if he were a stain with opinions. It isn't a confession, she said. It's a causation record. Malcolm did not correct her, which told me where the room had gone. Julian turned back to me. You'd really let clients walk over this? No, I said. You already invited them. That landed. Ashbridge's assurance lead spoke then for the first time in several minutes. For clarity, our renewal will not proceed absent documented restoration, attested domestic control continuity, and named authority independent from the executives who initiated the unreviewed change. There it was. Revenue with posture. The lender's observer added, our facility review will also depend on documented corrective governance. Julian looked from face to face and realized what men like him always realize too late. Charm does not execute inside an evidence chain. He tried once more. Claire, be reasonable. I held his gaze. I am being exact. Malcolm called a recess. 10 minutes. It became 22. When the board returned, Malcolm sat down, adjusted his glasses, and said, the board accepts your terms effective immediately. That was it. No speech about lessons. No cinematic apology. Just minutes, signatures, governance, and the sound of one preferred CEO being moved out from underneath his own adjectives. The permanent damage did not vanish because I came back. It just became measurable. Ashbridge did renew, but only after a 90-day remediation window and at a lower initial volume commitment. Deferred value, $8.4 million. River State reinstated its module expansion 2 quarters later, not immediately. Delayed value, $3.1 million. One regional insurer terminated a smaller workstream altogether after reading the remediation summary and deciding it disliked executive improvisation. Lost annual revenue, $2.7 million. Service credits paid across 6 accounts due to queue backlogs and missed turnaround commitments totaled $1.9 million. Emergency audit work, outside counsel, client remediation travel, retention payments, and vendor review costs added $4.6 million. The lender repriced Meridian's facility, increasing financing costs by an estimated $2.3 million over the next term. And the offshore transition plan Julian had promised would save $3.4 million annually in labor costs was scrapped after 12 days, a canceled lease, vendor penalties, and stranded onboarding costs worth another $2.8 million. Total measurable damage over 2 quarters, $25.8 million. They had tried to replace expensive American teams to save $3.4 million a year. Their shortcut cost them more than 7 times that in under 6 months. Poetry does not always look like verse. Sometimes it looks like a board packet with tabs. Julian was not fired on the spot because companies rarely move that honestly in daylight. Instead, he was placed on strategic leave pending governance review, which is corporate language for please stop touching anything while adults count. Owen was removed immediately. Lila lasted 19 days in an advisory role that involved no meaningful decisions and then vanished into the fog of executive LinkedIn. I stepped back into Meridian under the new title and rebuilt the company around the truth it had tried to outsource. The first 30 days were not glamorous. They were work. We restored full attestation coverage across all affected accounts. We revalidated 23 control schedules. We rebuilt staffing models around actual contractual obligations rather than fantasy geography. We promoted Denise Walcott to Vice President of Restricted Delivery Operations because anyone who says no correctly under pressure deserves authority. Ben and I hardened anchor again, adding board-level alert triggers for any future attempt to expand foreign access into restricted environments without approved review. Priya and I rewrote the service model governance policy so that no CEO could ever again pretend domestic handling language was an emotional preference. We added 2 deputy attestation officers, both properly trained, because I prefer not to be the only adult holding the keys if the building can learn. 8 months later, Meridian was smaller than Julian had planned and stronger than he deserved. Not everything came back. It should not have. Actions need a residue. But the clients that stayed trusted us more because the company had finally been forced to make its operating reality match its sales voice. The domestic team stopped flinching every time someone said optimization. People laughed in meetings again, which is often the first sign a place is healing. As for me, I stayed long enough to finish what I had priced. Then I moved on. A national payments processor in Minneapolis recruited me into a new role as Chief Delivery Integrity Officer, with a larger team, cleaner governance, and a CEO who had once worked in audit and therefore understood that evidence is just revenue wearing glasses. I took Denise with me 11 months later. Ben stayed at Meridian because someone had to keep the servers allergic to stupidity. My new office overlooked the Mississippi. The coffee was better. The board packets were shorter. My team was spread across 4 cities, all domestic, all properly documented, all paid like adults instead of line items. We built delivery systems that said what they did and did what they said. I slept better there. I cooked on Sundays. Maple got older and slower and somehow more judgmental. I bought a leather chair for my reading corner and used it. Small luxury. Deeply earned. One Thursday morning, almost a year after the boardroom meeting, I was scanning an industry newsletter before a steering call when a headline caught my eye. Meridian Atlas highlights U.S.-controlled delivery model in mid-market banking push. I opened it. There was a quote from Malcolm Center about renewed trust, disciplined governance, and differentiated domestic service integrity. There was also a line buried halfway down the article that made me smile into my coffee. The company's revised model followed a period of executive turnover and control redesign tied to offshore transition missteps in the prior year. Missteps. A tender word for a man who tried to sell out his own teams because the spreadsheet looked prettier from 30,000 feet. 2 days later, LinkedIn notified me that Julian Mercer had viewed my profile. No message. Of course not. Men like Julian do not enjoy written trails once the trail starts writing back. I looked at the notification once, closed it, and went back to reviewing a key residency map for a new healthcare client in Wisconsin. That felt correct. Because the truth in stories like this is never that the good people win by yelling louder. They do not. Loud people usually own the first half of corporate history. The quiet people win by understanding what the company actually is. They thought Meridian was a labor model with software wrapped around it. What they didn't know was it was a promise engine with contracts wired into the floorboards. They thought American teams were sentimental overhead. What they didn't know was those teams were the operational shape of the promises being sold. They thought I was guarding process. What they didn't know was I was guarding the sentence between "we can do that" and "yes, legally." And that sentence is always worth more than the men who try to cheapen it. If this one sounded familiar, if you ever watched a preferred CEO arrive with a polished deck and a list of people he planned to replace before he understood what they did, like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments what the load-bearing team was at your old company. The one leadership treated like a cost center right before it turned out to be the building. As for me, I kept the title, the dog, the better office, and the part of myself that never confuses confidence with authority. Meridian kept the contracts it had learned to respect. Julian kept the memory of asking for permission from the woman he told to hand over the map.